Okay, in this video I'm going to show you how to simplify radicals. So this is from Geometry Chapter 6, and it's the practice from Lesson 6.3. And it's asking you how to simplify radicals, and I'm going to start off with a relatively simple one in 75. I'm going to do this one first, and then I'm going to go along and do something even more complicated in 112. So I'll start with showing you how to simplify a radical if it's the square root of 75. I need to adjust this. If you have the square root of 75, right, let me zoom in a little bit, that way I can get big on this stuff. Okay. Whoa. That's huge. Alright, if you have something like the square root of 75, the simplest way to do that, to start off with, is to factor this number entirely first. So I'm off to the side, I'm going to write 75, and then I'm going to factor it completely. The first thing I know is that 75 is 3 25s, so 3 times 25 is the first factor. And then after that, 25 factored entirely is 5 times 5. So my entire factorization of 75 is 3 times 5 times 5. Now the important thing to note is that I have a pair of numbers there. And that's really important in the square root, because this pair of numbers, as you'll see in a moment, is going to actually be able to come outside of the square root because it is a perfect square together. Now, if I wanted to rewrite this square root of 75 using these factors, I could say the square root of 75 is 3 times 5 times 5. So I've just changed the way I wrote 75 by making it the factors of all the different pieces. And then once I've done this, I can separate it out a little bit by taking this pair and kind of putting it together. And I'm going to put it at the front of my square root just to make things a little bit simpler. So this becomes a square root of 5 times 5. And that whole square root, you can change it and break it apart into two different pieces. One has the perfect square separate from the rest of it, which is just the remainder left over. So that 5 times 5 becomes its own separate square root. Now, if I remember this, 5 times 5 is just 25. So I have the square root of 25 times the square root of 3. And then what's the square root of 25?
5.
There you go, just 5. So this becomes 5 times the square root of 3. So you've gone from 75, the square root of 75, and you've broken out the perfect square that you found in its factors, and that comes outside the square root. So another way of looking at this is to say that the 5 times 5 basically comes outside the square root. And so what you end up with is that number outside here. That perfect square inside the square root became a single number outside the square root. Now I'm going to try it with the next one, which is a little bit bigger, the square root of 112. And for this one, I'm probably going to have to use a calculator for it, just to help break it apart. So, square root of 112. Let's start by factoring it out first. If you don't remember how to do this, just remember that you can always take any number and divide it by a bunch of, you can test different numbers to try out. You can test out different numbers to see if they can factor the number out. For instance, I could try to divide this by 3. And that does not give me a perfect, a whole number, so that's not one of the factors that I can use. But because it's an even number, I can always divide it by 2. And that's probably the simplest way to start. So that gives me 56. So I can take 112 and break it apart in 2 times 56. 56 is still an even number. So I can come back here and do 56 divided by 2. That gives me 28. 2 and 28. Which I can split that one apart. Now I'm down to my regular factors. So this becomes 4 times 7. And this becomes 2 times 2. So the whole factorization, if I break this apart, has 2 pairs. One of it is right here. And the other one is right here. So those are my 2 pairs of numbers I can use. Again, to do it the long way, it becomes 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 7, which, having these 2 pairs of numbers, lets me break them outside of the square root. So I'm going to separate those out by themselves. 2 times 2 times the square root of 2 times 2 times the square root of 7. And after I've done that, I can just turn each one of these, the square root of 2 times 2, just becomes the square root of 4. And each one of those just becomes 2 times the square root of 7. Which, if you multiply 2 times 2, is just 4 times the square root of 7. And there you are, you're done. That's your final answer. That's how you factor square roots and simplify them.